Maya
Do
had
you
been
know
working
who
at
I
Mercy
am?
Private Hospital in
You don't
Miami for
belong
9
in a
years,
place like
had
this.
built a reputation as one of the most dedicated and compassionate nurses on staff, had become someone that patients specifically requested because they understood that her care came from genuine commitment to their well-being rather than from obligation. She was 36, had worked her way through nursing school while raising her younger brother, had dedicated her career to providing excellent care for everyone who came through the hospital doors regardless of their ability to pay. She was respected by her colleagues, beloved by her patients, and trusted by physicians to manage complex medical situations with competence and grace. She had also become invisible to people like Victoria Ashworth. Victoria was 42, had married Richard Ashworth 30 years earlier when he was already a successful venture capitalist, and she was a young woman from a wealthy family who understood that marriage was about financial consolidation rather than about love. Over the decades, as Richard had become a billionaire, Victoria had become the kind of woman who believed that money gave her the right to treat service workers as subhuman. She had never been openly cruel in ways that could be documented or addressed. She had simply treated nurses, housekeepers, assistants, drivers, and anyone else she perceived as beneath her with a casual contempt that suggested she was not even conscious of how she was speaking to them. She made demands without pleas. She made comments about appearance or competence without regard for how those comments might land. She treated service workers as background scenery rather than as human beings. Maya had encountered women like Victoria before, people whose money had calcified into certainty that they were inherently superior to anyone not born into similar circumstances. She had learned how to maintain her dignity while being treated with contempt, how to do her job excellently regardless of how she was being addressed, how to refuse to absorb the toxicity of someone else's arrogance. But on the day that everything changed, Victoria had crossed a line from casual contempt into something much darker. Richard had been admitted to the hospital for a planned surgical procedure, nothing life-threatening, just an elective surgery that required a few days of hospitalization and recovery. Victoria had decided to stay at the hospital during his recovery, had insisted on a private suite, had made clear that she wanted the best care for her husband. She had not understood that best care required respecting the people who were providing it. Maya had been assigned to Richard's care. She had reviewed his medical history, had prepared his room, had ensured that everything was in place for his procedure and recovery. She had been professional and warm, had done everything possible to make both Richard and Victoria comfortable. Victoria had responded to this care with increasing rudeness. On the second day of Richard's hospitalization, when Maya had come in to check his vital signs and help him with basic mobility, Victoria had been sitting in the room. She had watched Maya work, and then she had made a comment. "I am surprised they allowed someone like you to work in a hospital like this." Maya had not responded. She had continued her work, had taken Richard's blood pressure, had adjusted his medications, had maintained her professional composure. "I am talking to you," Victoria had continued. "Do not you have other jobs more suited to your capabilities? I would think a hospital of this caliber would want staff who actually belong here." Still, Maya had not engaged. She had finished her tasks and had prepared to leave the room. But Victoria had not been done. "When my husband is discharged from this hospital, I will be recommending that your employment be reviewed. I do not believe you are the appropriate standard of care for patients of his status. I believe this hospital is making a mistake in allowing you to provide care to people like us." That had crossed a line that Maya had not anticipated. This was not casual contempt anymore. This was a deliberate attempt to damage Maya's career, to use wealth and influence to punish her for existing, for working, for doing her job competently while having the wrong skin color. Maya had maintained her composure. She had finished her shift. She had gone home and had cried, had questioned whether continuing to work in healthcare was worth the constant exposure to people like Victoria, had wondered whether there was any environment in which she could build a career without being reminded that her presence was considered a problem. She had shown up for her next shift because that was what she did. She showed up, she did her job, she maintained her dignity. She had not known that someone else was about to show up and fundamentally alter the power dynamic of the situation. Dae-Young Park was 46, had spent 30 years building himself from street-level enforcer to one of Miami's most powerful organized crime figures. He controlled operations across South Florida, managed money laundering through legitimate businesses, maintained relationships with corrupt officials who looked the other way regarding his operations. He was also someone who understood power in ways that went far beyond the financial power that someone like Victoria possessed. He had come to Mercy Private Hospital because his lieutenant had been injured in a business conflict and required medical care that could be provided discreetly at a private facility. Dae-young had arranged for the best care, had paid premium rates for privacy, had ensured that his lieutenant would recover in comfort and security. While his lieutenant was recovering, Dae-young had decided to walk through the hospital. He was always curious about environments he was not familiar with, always interested in understanding how institutions operated, always looking for potential vulnerabilities or opportunities. He had observed the interaction between Victoria and Maya. He had been standing in the hallway, ostensibly reviewing his phone, but actually watching the dynamics between the billionaire's wife and the black nurse. He had seen Victoria's contempt. He had seen Maya's composed professionalism. He had heard Victoria's threat about Maya's employment. And he had understood that what he was witnessing was someone with financial power attempting to weaponize that power against someone who had done nothing wrong except exist in a space where Victoria believed she did not belong. Dae-young had made a decision. He had waited for Maya to leave Richard's room. He had waited for Victoria to be momentarily alone. And then he had entered the room. Victoria had not recognized him. She had not understood who he was. She had simply seen an Asian man in a black suit and had assumed he was some kind of hospital staff. "Can I help you? Are you looking for something?" she had asked with the automatic dismissiveness she brought to all interactions with service workers. "I am looking for understanding," Dae-young had said quietly. "I want to understand why you spoke to your husband's nurse the way you did." Victoria had been confused by the question. "That is none of your business. Who are you?" "I am someone who was in the hallway when you told your husband's nurse that you would be recommending her termination because of her race. I am someone who understands that there is a significant difference between having money and actually having power. And I am someone who is about to ensure that you understand that difference as well." Victoria had assumed he was hospital administration. She had not been afraid. She had simply become more indignant. "I have every right to provide feedback about the staff at this hospital. If I feel that my husband is not receiving appropriate care, your husband is receiving excellent care from someone who is far more qualified to assess medical competence than you are. What you did was attempt to punish her for existing while being black. And I am here to tell you that there are consequences for that behavior." "Who are you?" "I do not know who you think you are, but I can have security remove you from this room." Dae-young had not raised his voice. He had simply continued speaking with absolute calm. "I am Dae-young Park. I own significant portions of this hospital through legitimate business interests. I also have significant influence over the financial decisions that are made regarding this facility. And I am telling you that if you make any attempt to damage that nurse's career, I will ensure that your husband's business interests face complications that he will find very difficult to manage." Victoria had stared at him, clearly trying to assess whether this was a legitimate threat or merely someone attempting to intimidate her. "You cannot threaten me. My husband is far more powerful than. Your husband is a businessman. That is a different kind of power than the kind I represent. If you want to test the distinction, I am happy to provide a comprehensive demonstration. But I suspect you are intelligent enough to understand the implication." He had left the room without waiting for a response. What had followed was a series of events that had demonstrated very clearly the difference between financial power and actual power. Richard had noticed that his investment portfolio had begun experiencing unusual complications. Certain deals that should have gone smoothly had encountered unexpected regulatory obstacles. Business associates who had been reliable for years had suddenly become unavailable. Communications that should have been straightforward had become mysteriously delayed. None of this was directly traceable to Dae-young, but the pattern was clear enough that Richard understood it was intentional. He had called a meeting with his wife to discuss what was happening. "Something is wrong with our business. Deals are falling through. Associates are becoming evasive. Something has changed." Victoria had told him about the interaction with Dae-young. Richard's face had gone pale. "Do you understand who that man is? Do you understand what you have done? He was threatening me. He said he would damage your business if I." "He was not threatening you. He was explaining consequences. And now he is demonstrating those consequences. If we want this to stop, I have to do something about it. Richard had arranged a meeting with Dae-young. Not through his normal channels, but through intermediaries who understood the necessity of approaching someone like Dae-young with appropriate deference. The meeting had taken place in a neutral location, a private club where business discussions could happen without being observed or recorded. Your wife spoke to one of my employees in a way that was disrespectful and harmful. She attempted to weaponize her financial position to damage someone who had done nothing wrong except provide excellent care to you. I took action to ensure she understood that there are consequences for that behavior. I understand. I am here to apologize on behalf of my wife and to ensure that this situation is resolved. The situation is resolved once your wife provides a genuine apology to the nurse she attempted to harm. Once she acknowledges that her behavior was inappropriate, and once she demonstrates through future behavior that she has understood the lesson. Richard had agreed. He had returned home and had insisted that Victoria provide that apology. Victoria had been furious. She had not wanted to apologize to someone she considered beneath her. But Richard had made clear that the alternative was watching their entire business empire be systematically dismantled by someone who had the power to do it. She had provided an apology. Not a genuine one, but one that was publicly delivered and that acknowledged her behavior as inappropriate. Maya had received the apology with grace. She had accepted it without requiring anything more from Victoria, had maintained her professional demeanor, had continued to provide excellent care to Richard for the remainder of his hospitalization. What had changed was the power dynamic. Everyone at the hospital understood what had happened. Everyone understood that Maya had someone protecting her, someone who had power that superseded financial power, someone who had demonstrated that attacking Maya would have consequences. Victoria's reputation at the hospital had been destroyed, not through any public announcement, but through the knowledge that she had attempted to harm an employee and had been stopped by someone far more powerful than she was. Maya had continued her work, had been promoted to senior nurse supervisor within 2 years, had used the protection that Dae-young had provided to build a career that was no longer constantly threatened by people with more money. 2 years after the incident at the hospital, Dae-young had arranged to speak with Maya privately. I want to know if there are other situations like what happened with Victoria. Are there other places where you are being treated with disrespect based on your race? Are there other environments where people are using their financial or social position to diminish you? Maya had been honest. There are always situations like that. I work in healthcare. I encounter people like Victoria regularly. What is different now is that I know that there are consequences for crossing certain lines. That has changed how people treat me. I did not intervene for your gratitude. I intervened because what happened was unjust and because I have the power to address injustice when I encounter it. But I want you to understand that you can contact me if there are other situations that require intervention. He had given her a card, not a business card exactly, but a number that would reach him through intermediaries. Over the following years, Dae-young had intervened in several situations. A restaurant manager who had attempted to refuse service to Maya based on her race, a landlord who had attempted to discriminate against her in housing options, a healthcare administrator who had attempted to discipline her unfairly based on racial bias. In each situation, he had not used violence or explicit threats. He had simply demonstrated that there were consequences for certain behaviors, that someone with actual power was watching, that attacking Maya would result in complications that the attacker would find very difficult to manage. What had emerged over time was not a romantic relationship, but a genuine friendship. Two people from very different worlds who had found connection in their commitment to justice, in their understanding that power should be used to protect rather than to exploit. 5 years after the incident with Victoria, Dae-young had begun the process of stepping back from his most violent criminal operations. Not because Maya had asked him to, but because he had come to understand that the power he had exercised most effectively was not the power to harm, but the power to protect. He had restructured his organization to focus on less destructive criminal enterprise. He had reduced his direct involvement in operations that caused obvious harm to vulnerable populations. He had used his resources to support causes that Maya cared about: healthcare access, racial justice, support for people experiencing discrimination. He had essentially become the kind of person who could use power for good without requiring that goodness to be compensated through romantic attachment. 10 years after defending Maya against Victoria's contempt, Dae-young was speaking at a conference about organized crime rehabilitation and the use of power to address systemic injustice. I spent the first half of my life using power to exploit. I spent the second half of my life using power to protect. The difference is not complicated. It is simply a choice about whether you use your influence to harm the vulnerable or to shield them from harm. He paused. There is a woman who works as a nurse in Miami. She is exceptionally competent, deeply compassionate, and committed to providing excellent care regardless of a patient's ability to pay. Because of those qualities, she has been targeted repeatedly by people who believe that money gives them the right to be cruel. I have intervened in those situations not because I am a hero, but because I have the power to intervene, and I have decided that using power to prevent harm is more valuable than using power to cause it. Maya, listening to the speech, understood that Dae-young had transformed in ways that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with his own understanding of what power should be used for. Victoria had eventually died, quietly, in ways that were not particularly dramatic. Richard had continued his business, without her influence. The hospital had moved forward. And Maya had continued her work, had been promoted to chief nursing officer within 15 years, had used her position to ensure that other nurses of color were protected from the kind of discrimination she had experienced. What the story proved was that power operates in complex ways. Financial power is real, but it is limited. The power to cause systematic harm is real, but it can be countered by the power to protect and to enforce consequences. The power to change systems is real, but it requires people willing to exercise that power in service of justice rather than in service of personal enrichment. Maya had never asked Dae-young to stop being who he was. She had simply created a friendship with someone who had decided that his power could be used to protect her and people like her from the casual cruelty that wealth could purchase. And Dae-young had discovered that there was more satisfaction in that protection than in all the empire he had built through exploitation.